Imagine a city where the church towers pierce the gray sky like spears, and the streets below are so narrow that neighbors can shake hands from their bedroom windows. This is York in the 1500s, a place of immense power, holy rebellion, and unholy stench, where a single decision by a king in London could leave bodies hanging from the tower walls. To truly understand life in the 1500s, you have to strip away the romantic image of merry old England and step into the mud. If you were dropped into York at the turn of the 16th century, the first thing to hit you wouldn't be the sight of the magnificent minster. It would be the smell. Bless you, child. York was the capital of the north, the second most important city in the kingdom. But it was also a medieval pressure cooker, tightly squeezed inside ancient Roman and Viking walls. The population was crammed into a space barely larger than a modern university campus, creating a crowdedness that we can barely imagine today. In this era, the streets, known locally as snickleways, were less like roads and more like open sewers. Sanitation was non-existent. There was no underground plumbing, only open gutters running down the center of the cobblestones. The muck was so legendary that the city corporation actually had to pass a specific act of parliament in 1532 just to get the main streets paved because carts were literally being swallowed whole by the mud. The architecture reflected this chaotic crowdedness. People lived in jettied, timber-framed houses, the kind you still see in the city today. These weren't built this way just for style. They were a tax evasion strategy and a space-saving necessity. By building the second floor to stick out over the first and the third over the second, you maximized floor space without paying for a larger street footprint. However, this turned the streets into dark, damp tunnels where sunlight rarely touched the ground. In the famous Shambles, the butcher's quarter, the houses leaned so close together that they nearly touched at the roofline. Here, the sensory overload was at its peak. Butchers displayed meat on open shelves called flesh shambles, and the slaughter happened right there in the shop. The floors were slanted so that blood and offal could be swept directly into the street where it would be cleaned up by the city's unofficial sanitation workers. The pigs, herds of swine roamed free, rooting through the midden heaps, piles of household waste that residents simply dumped outside their front doors. Yet amidst this filth, there was a sophisticated infrastructure of community and faith. The city was dominated by the River Ouse, which was the superhighway of the era, bringing in wool, wine, and spices. Crossing it was Ouse Bridge, a marvel of engineering that was so crowded it looked like a small town floating on water. It didn't just carry traffic. It held shops, a council chamber, a prison for debtors and kidnappers, and even a chapel, Street, Williams, all piled precariously onto the stone arches. Life here was loud and communal. Privacy was a foreign concept. With thin wattle and daub walls, you knew every detail of your neighbor's life. Your social status, your livelihood, and your safety net were all tied to the guilds, powerful associations of craftsmen like the merchant adventurers. And looming over it all was the church. York was a fiercely Catholic city with over 40 parish churches crammed within the walls. The bells rang constantly, marking the hours, the masses, and the curfews. This religious devotion was the glue that held the filthy, vibrant city together. But as the 1530s approached, that same devotion was about to trigger the most violent and defining event in the city's history. The religious devotion that defined York would ultimately become its greatest danger, leading to the single most catastrophic event of the century, the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. To understand the magnitude of this, you have to realize that York wasn't just a city of churches. It was a religious powerhouse, fueled by the massive wealth of the Catholic institutions. The skyline was dominated not just by the minster, but by Street, Mary's Abbey, the richest and most powerful monastery in the north of England. The monks were the city's biggest employers, its landlords, and its welfare system. So when Henry VIII decided to break from Rome and began the dissolution of the monasteries, he wasn't just changing a religion. He was destroying York's entire economy and social fabric. The people of York didn't take this lying down. In October 1536, a lawyer named Robert Aske led a massive uprising. This wasn't a mob of peasants with pitchforks. It was a disciplined army of 30,000 people, including lords and knights, marching under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. They didn't have to siege York. The city threw open its gates and welcomed them. For a brief, intoxicating moment, York was the capital of a free Catholic North, standing in open defiance of the Tudor king in London. But the hope was short-lived, and the punishment was brutal. Henry VIII played a cunning game, promising pardons and a parliament in York to disperse the rebel army, only to turn around and crush them once they had gone home. The crackdown changed the atmosphere of the city from one of pious celebration to paranoid fear. Robert Aske, the leader who had been welcomed as a hero, was dragged back to York in chains. On a sweltering day in July 1537, he was brought to Clifford's Tower, the castle keep that still stands today, and hung in chains from the walls. Unlike a standard hanging, this was a slow, agonizing death meant to send a message to every citizen watching below. The North had been broken. The king didn't stop at executions. He proceeded to physically dismantle the city's infrastructure. The great street, Mary's Abbey, was seized, its roof stripped of lead, and its stone quarried to build administrative offices. The library, filled with centuries of knowledge, was destroyed, and the monks were cast out into the streets. This period marked a grim transition for the city. With the monasteries gone, the safety net for the poor collapsed, leading to a surge in vagrancy and desperate poverty that the city guilds couldn't handle. The vibe of the streets shifted from the bustle of pilgrims to the rigid control of bureaucrats. To ensure York never rebelled again, Henry established the Council of the North. They took over the abbot's house, now known as the King's Manor, and turned York into a government town. The city became the administrative headquarters for the entire north of England. While this brought a different kind of prestige and an influx of lawyers and officials, the soul of the medieval city had been ripped out. The grand processions of the mystery plays were suppressed because they were seen as too Catholic, and the colorful, chaotic, holy city began to turn gray. The 1500s in York started with the ringing of bells and the chanting of monks, but the middle of the century was defined by the sound of falling masonry and the silence of a population terrified to speak against the king. Good night to you, neighbor. As the 1500s drew to a close under the reign of Elizabeth I, York had transformed from a loud, open religious carnival into a city of secrets and spies. The Council of the North had turned the city into a mini London, a hub for lawyers and gentry. But beneath the surface, a dangerous game of cat and mouse was being played. While the public face of York was now strictly Protestant, the old faith hadn't vanished. It had just gone underground. This era gave birth to one of York's most harrowing stories, that of Margaret Clitherow, the Pearl of York, a butcher's wife living on the Shambles. She secretly hid Catholic priests in a purpose-built chamber in her attic. In 1586, she was caught. Her execution wasn't a quick beheading. To avoid implicating her children, she refused to plead, and the law demanded she be pressed to death. She was laid on the ground with a sharp rock under her back, and a door loaded with 700 pounds of weights was placed on top of her until she was crushed. Her house on the Shambles is still a shrine today, a dark reminder that the golden age of Elizabeth was a time of terror for many in the North. The cultural heartbeat of the city was also forcibly changed. For centuries, the York Mystery Plays had been the city's pride, a massive community effort involving every guild. But the Protestant authorities viewed these plays as popish superstition. In 1569, the unthinkable happened. The plays were suppressed for the final time in the century. The vibrant street theater that defined the city's identity was silenced. So how did people fill the void? Life became less about public ritual and more about private vice and regulated leisure. The alehouses were booming. Drinking remained the favorite pastime of all classes, largely because small beer was safer than water. For the wealthy merchants dining in the magnificent Merchant Adventurers Hall, life was good. They feasted on roasted peacock and imported wines. For the poor, entertainment was brutal. Bear baiting and cockfighting were hugely popular blood sports, often held near the castle, drawing crowds to gamble on the violence. The infrastructure, meanwhile, faced the wrath of nature. In 1564, a catastrophic winter flood surged down the River Ouse. The ice and water smashed into the famous Ouse Bridge, sweeping away the central two arches along with 12 houses and killing 12 people. It severed the city in two. Rebuilding it took years and nearly bankrupted the corporation, forcing them to beg for money from across the country. By the time the clock struck midnight on December the 31st, 1599, York was unrecognizable from the city of 1,500. It had lost its abbeys, lost its plays, and lost its independence to the crown's bureaucrats. The wool trade, once the source of its immense wealth, was dying as trade moved to the west-riding towns like Leeds and Halifax. York ended the century not as a manufacturing powerhouse, but as a genteel administrative capital, a city of lawyers, ruins, and ghosts, waiting for a new identity to emerge from the shadows of the past.